the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Allison Nissen. And today I am lucky enough to be with John Davis Jr. John, could you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Sure. I am an 8th-generation Floridian, and I primarily write poetry, although I have done some nonfiction, journalism, and even fiction in the past. Right now, the thing I'm most excited about is my latest book, which is The Places That Hold from Eastover Press. This is my 5th book. My other books, including Middle Class American Proverb from Negative Capability Press and Hard Inheritance from Five Oaks Press, along with others, have certainly sort of led up to this moment, and I'm just really excited to be here talking about it.
No, that's fantastic. So a lot of these poems, they sound like they deal with a lot of deep, dark stuff.
Certainly the central poems in this collection are about darker subject matter, but I guess the good thing about that is they are sandwiched by poems that deal more with things like history and family and some of the kinder, gentler subjects that poetry can often address as well. And so while the middle section of poems dealing with the Dozier Reform School and some of the terrible things that happened there give a little shadow to this collection, there are plenty of others that also explore nicer or lighter or perhaps even more lovely things.
How did the Dozier School or Dozier Reform School get on your radar?
I guess it was about probably 2012 to 2014. And I had been in education for a while, and I'm also a dad of 2 boys. And the first school I ever taught at was a juvenile boot camp in Bartow, Florida. And that school made such a positive difference in the lives of young men and young women that it really struck me as incredibly wrong that there would have been a reform school that was supposed to be serving boys that did the things that people did at Dozier. And the more I looked into the story and the more I heard about it and the more it was explored, the more I felt compelled to address this whole thing with poetry, because I believe that it is an art form that allows us to investigate things in a way that perhaps other forms of writing do not. As much difference as journalism can make and as much difference as prose can make, sometimes poetry cuts to the heart of the matter. And certainly that's what I was aiming to do with these poems about that subject.
Refresh my memory. Is the Dozier Reform School the one where they found all the bodies buried?
It is indeed. The first find they made was 55 boys, 55 bodies. And they were in unmarked graves. And that was not necessarily the first red flag, but certainly the most prominent. And I, in fact, have a poem about the 55 boys who were uncovered during that rather grisly discovery in this collection. And so, yeah, it is where the bodies of boys were discovered, and there were also 41 others who died while under the care of Dozier Reform School, who at the time of the book being written had not yet been found. It is still unknown as to their exact whereabouts. So that kind of remains a mystery.
What a sad, sad time for the whole area that, that shadows that. It creates this sense of sadness. You're right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly not a pleasant subject, but it was one that was worthy of investigation and reflection upon through poetry. And the more I found out and the more I spoke with people and did my own homework, the more things began to come to the forefront that were worthy of poems and poetry. And so while it was a terrible chapter in Florida's history and in the lives of people who were affected by it, it also opened a door to exploration in this way. And so I have been grateful for the opportunity to speak about this, even though it was tragic.
Do you feel like you were able to give a voice to those that were voiceless?
I certainly hope so. I have done my best through these poems to highlight a number of the injustices that took place there at Dozier. And in some cases, I have done so using persona poetry, that is, writing with the voice of others. In some cases, the voices that I have chosen belong to those who are no longer with us. And so I took it as a very almost sacred obligation to represent the message they would have conveyed in a way that is both respectful as well as accurate.
What do you hope that this book is able to achieve?
I hope that this book gives continued attention to corrections reform, especially youth corrections reform, not only here in Florida but elsewhere. But along with that, I don't want people to miss the brighter points in this collection as well. Things dealing with Florida history, things dealing with matters like family, and the difference that others in our lives can make in a very positive way. I'm hopeful that by seeing the juxtaposition of darkness and light in this collection, people are able to not only say, boy, here was a really terrible thing that happened, but also, here's how good things can be as well, and bring both of those into kind of a mental cooperation.
Ooh, that's a nice way to phrase that, a mental cooperation.
Thank you.
So as an 8th generation Floridian, that's quite an amazing thing, because so many people are flocking to Florida right now, literally, this, not just snowbirds, because it is the winter. But
yes.
Do you find that studying this history as a Floridian, as an 8th generation, is somewhat more special to you because of that?
To a certain degree, yes. So often, I feel like I have written about the chapters in Florida history that shed a positive light on our state. And I have done that intentionally for obvious reasons. I am a proud Floridian, but by the same token, there is a duty, there is a responsibility that all writers have to explore both the good and the bad. And so, while on the one hand, I'm not proud of what happened at Dozier at all, I'm hopeful that through my writing about it, I may be able, as a Floridian and then as a poet as well, to do something positive with this awful thing that transpired.
Well, I'm sure that your poems do that. But while we're talking about poems, do you have a specific method that you like to use when you start a poem?
You know, it's funny. A number of years ago, I did a whole blog series on epiphanies and revelations, and I kind of chronicled how my poems begin. Sometimes it's a first line that occurs to me that I have to scribble down and then explore further, maybe later on. Sometimes it's a very striking visual image that speaks to me that then I explore with words. And sometimes it's just an inexplicable sense that something needs to be written down that is neither visual nor verbal. It's hard to give it a name or give it a label. It's that kind of intangible inspiration that comes upon artists and poets and musicians and folks in the creative line of work. And I'm lucky in that I do have some of those visitations myself. However, after receiving that kind of inspiration, I'm one who believes in multiple drafts of a poem. I would say every poem I write goes through at least 5 different drafts. It goes through 5 copies, probably more, honestly, because then once it's on my computer and I leave it alone and I come back to it, I hear things and see things that need to be tweaked or refined or polished up a little bit. And so that happens as well.
So you put it down, you write it down, and then you go back. Do you just keep reading it, or do you layer, like you try to get more sensations?
Sometimes. If I have written a poem and there's not a great deal of striking imagery in it, occasionally I will look that poem over and say, well, what am I missing here? What is it that I have left out? If this is strictly factual information, then that's not necessarily a poem. I need something more than that. I need to put more into this that gives it artistic quality, that gives it that intangible thing that lets people know this is a poem, as opposed to simply some other form of writing.
Do you, and speaking as a poet, and I write poetry, and I think I do a pretty good job of it, but I would not call myself a poet. So there's poetry that's read silently, and there's poetry that's meant to be spoken aloud. Is your poetry meant to be spoken aloud, or both, or how does that, what do you think about that as a concept?
My poetry is a little bit of both. While it is not exclusively spoken word poetry or slam poetry, I'm hopeful that people will read it aloud, perhaps on their own, and hear the musicality of the language. I believe that poetry should be aimed toward being heard, as well as read silently, inside the mind. And I've had a lot of really good writing mentors over the years who have advocated firmly on behalf of writing poetry that has both sound and sense, as Robert Frost would say.
When I first started teaching, I had to teach poetry, and I jumped into somebody else's curriculum. So I didn't select anything. And I was not into poetry. I had a poetry class in college. I don't think I did very well. I actually think I turned in a limerick as one of my poetry challenges, and that my professor was not happy about that one. But on my way to teach Sylvia Plath's daddy, it happened to be the anniversary of her birth or her death, I'm not sure which, and NPR did a special on her, and they actually played her reading Daddy while I was in the car to go to my class to teach Daddy. So I call that serendipity. I like to think that the universe collided with me at that particular point on purpose so that I could be on track. I will say, in that moment, I understood poetry 100%. It was like a door opened and I walked through it instantly. Like, I get it. I get poetry, but it really did take that inspiration of hearing the words spoken and the passion that she had when she read. I don't know if you happened to listen to that particular reading, but she's extremely passionate, and it's obviously not biographical in the literal sense, but you can feel her emotion, her pain. And that to me is what's the great part about poetry, is when you could really throw that stuff in there and just it's like a catharsis, which is, exactly what Aristotle would say, but it's that catharsis. It's getting it out and being able to communicate your message with all that passion.
Yes, absolutely. I'm 100% on board with that. I love Sylvia Plath's work.
Anyway, that was my little story with poetry. I love to tell it because I think it's like, really, what are the odds that the universe had to be with me on that one, because there is no other way to explain the fact that I would even put NPR on. I would even be, attuned to that it's Sylvia Plath and that I was driving to class. So anyway, I'm all good with that one. So as a teacher, how do you teach poetry?
I think it depends on the poem, honestly. I spent, for example, a good amount of time with my 10th grade students earlier this year, examining some of the better known canonized American works like Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden, My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Retke,
One of my
and
favorites.
similar works. And whenever we're looking at poems in that way, usually we do a single read through just to hear the poem in its initial form. And we're not doing a great deal of discussion or analysis. We're not picking it apart. We're just hearing the words to hear the words, honestly. And then after we have done one read through, we'll go line by line and image by image and sometimes word by word, depending upon the needs of the poem itself. Because, especially in the case of those poems that I just mentioned, there are so many layers to be explored. There are so many different avenues that students need to kind of go down mentally whenever they're looking at Those Winter Sundays, My Papa's Waltz, and similar work. You mentioned Sylvia Plath's Daddy. That was actually one of the poems that was included in that study, along with poems like Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. The Life for Me Ain't Been No Crystal Stair poem is how some people know it. And in teaching those kinds of poems, just allowing students to hear the words first and foremost, and allowing them to kind of absorb what the poet wanted to have heard first and foremost, beyond the deeper exploration. It does them a great favor when we do that, because then it's a little more like music, it's a little more like song, which they are very acclimated to. But then also it allows them on first read to begin making those text-to-self connections. When Hugh says, "Life for me ain't been no crystal stair," in the voice or in the persona of this mother, there's an awful lot of students who can empathize with that because they have parents at home for whom life hasn't been a crystal stair either. The same thing is true with the adolescent in Those Winter Sundays, the adult looking back on himself as an adolescent. Speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. These kids, especially the boys that I presently teach, they know what it means to speak indifferently to an authority figure in your life because you're kind of an ungrateful kid. And so all of that to say, we kind of approach poems in a lot of different ways depending upon the individual piece we're looking at and the poet who wrote it.
That is very well said. I like how you talk about the understanding. And because you teach high school, I'm going to ask about music. As you said, they know lyrics from songs. And then rapping is all the rage, but is that poetry? I know, you could say Bruce Springsteen or Bob Dylan. Some of those are very poetic songs. What do you think about modern music and poetry?
There is a very strong case to be made for both rap and hip hop as poetry. In fact, Erica Dawson recently penned a work entitled "When Rap Spoke Straight to God." And a lot of the influences in her work come straight out of that genre of music, which in and of itself is poetic. To kind of extend that, there are rappers and hip-hop artists who have created entire books of their own poetry. Tupac Shakur, good example. The Rose That Grew from Concrete, and similar works like that. They really allow us to see that this is not just a bunch of really clever sounding words strung together without any kind of underlying literary purpose, but instead something much larger and something we should attempt to understand as the audience.
Do you find that understanding the rap and hip hop helps you connect with your students more?
Sometimes. It kind of depends upon the demographics of my classroom. I have students who appreciate all different kinds of music. I have some students who are very much into, for example, country music, and even the new country music, which I won't go into my feelings on that right here, right now. That would probably need another podcast. But we have discussions about what are the values that are being used or expressed here. And, is this something that is going to have redeeming cultural and societal value in 50 years or more? Or is this something that is merely a passing fad and won't really wind up on anybody's radar once this era has passed us by?
Very interesting conversation. I would love to have you back to have that conversation about music and poetry and society. And I love the idea of, will it have value in 50 years? That's such a great way to look at it. John Davis Jr., how can people get in touch with you?
They can contact me through my website, which is poetjohndavisjr.com. I do have a contact me page there that they can email me through. And other than that, I guess you could send me good old-fashioned U.S. postal mail. My mailing address is widely available out there on the internet and through Poets and Writers, their website, pw.org. So I'm always open to fan mail.
That's great. Well, are you ready to switch to our rapid-fire questions?
Absolutely.
What was your favorite childhood food?
My favorite childhood food was chicken and dumplings made by my Aunt Dodie.
Ooh, very nice. Do you have a very quick, short, funny teaching story?
I had a young lady walk into one of my classes with a gigantic bandage on her forehead one day, and when I made the mistake of inquiring, she informed me that while her skin didn't crack, it does get pimples. And then she sat down.
That's great. She can write a poem about it sometime.
Yes.
My final question. Favorite family vacation?
My favorite family vacation was taken in 2016. My wife and my boys and I went to Lisbon, Portugal. And I was there as part of the Disquiet International Literary Program through a friend of mine, Jeff Parker, who operates that opportunity. But while we were there, of course, we got to experience all of the goodness that is Portugal. We got to do the food, and we got to experience fado music, and we got to see ancient ruins of things like ancient convents that had been affected by the famous earthquake that happened there so long ago. And really, as far as memorability of vacations go, I think Lisbon, Portugal was probably right at the top of my list.
Absolutely. One of my favorite places to visit. I would highly recommend it. If you haven't been there, definitely put that on your bucket list. John Davis Jr., thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. This has been great.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Allison Nissen. Allison out. Ooh, we're all done. John Davis Jr. is the author of Hard Inheritance, Middle Class American Proverb, other books of poetry, including Places That Hold, his latest work. He's been nominated multiple times for the Pushcart Prize and holds an MFA from the University of Tampa. His writings are published in literary journals throughout the South and around the world. He teaches English and literature in the Tampa Bay area. For more information on John, visit his website at poetjohndavisjr.com. That's jr.com. For more information about the Florida Writers Association, visit us at floridawriters.org. Until next time.